Kristin, I want to thank you so much for visiting with us at the Chennai Storytelling Festival 2022. I've really been looking forward to your workshop, which is titled Melding the Japanese Art of Kintsugi with Narrative Therapy Practices, a fascinating topic. So please introduce yourself fully, tell us about your work, and please lead us on this workshop.
Thank you so much, Eric. And it's a pleasure to be with you all again for this workshop. The workshop evolved out of a personal experience I had in October of 2018, and I'm very transparent about that experience. I attended a retreat for survivors of childhood sexual abuse and assault. And at that workshop, one of the practices we did was kintsugi, which is the Japanese art of mending broken pottery with glue and gold. And the whole idea is that rather than hiding the breakage, we illuminate it, and what might we see differently? And the idea that we're not forever broken, we are not beyond repair. And that workshop, even without any kind of therapeutic questions, was incredibly powerful. So it planted a seed, and in 2019, I started traveling across the country, across the US and Canada, doing another workshop I developed called Steer Your Story, which was about how to sort of get in the driver's seat of your life narrative and sort of take the wheel and take control of that narrative. And those kintsugi workshops, I started doing them with sort of one layer of therapeutic questions. And the reason I'm sharing this is it evolved over time. And then the summer of 2019, narrative therapy practices found me. I had not heard of that field, and apparently that's what I had been doing for almost 30 years, but I didn't have the terminology, I didn't have the words. And I'll tell you more about narrative in a moment. Just wanted to introduce sort of a little bit of the background. And then narrative therapy practices really informed the kintsugi workshops I was doing. So it became this exploration of metaphors of kintsugi itself, and then looking at broken differently, looking at all the layers and looking at the pieces, even as we literally hold the pieces of pottery in our hands, looking at the glue and what is the glue that mends us? What is the glue that keeps us going and helps us survive? And then what is the gold, what's illuminated? So all of those questions, those metaphors became layers. And then with the narrative therapy masters completed last year, it helped set another, it's like all these layers of foundation to hold the program up. So that's a little bit about the project itself. And then for me, now I'm a narrative therapy practitioner. And some of you know me through performative world. I'm also a performative storyteller who tells a range of things, folk tales and personal narrative, as well as collecting stories to break stereotypes. So that's been a journey over time, and it's changed a lot over time. So I want to land with you. That was just to tell you a little bit about me. And before we dive into the workshop itself, some of you are joining from whatever you are doing out in the world. Some of you are joining from just attending another workshop. And I wanted to take a moment to breathe with you and to land with you. So I'd like to share a breathing technique that you may already know, and it's called 4-7-8. And I'll lead you through it. We'll take a breath in for the count of 4. We'll hold it for a count of 7. And then we'll release it for a count of 8. Acknowledging your counting might be a little different than my counting, and that's totally okay. So I'll just indicate when to breathe in, when to hold it, when to release. If you wish to close your eyes, you may. I like to close my eyes when I do this breathing. For me, that helps me land more. You do whatever feels comfortable for you. So I'm going to close my eyes. And we'll take a nice deep breath in for a count of 4, whatever that is for you. And we'll hold it for a count of 7. and we'll release for a count of 8. And we'll take a nice deep breath in for a count of 4. And we'll hold it for a count of 7. And release for a count of 8. And one more, we'll breathe in for a count of 4. And we'll hold for a count of 7. And release for a count of 8. And if your eyes were closed, you may open them. That breathing technique, congratulations to each of you. You have just activated your parasympathetic nervous system. So this is a breathing technique I use all the time. I also wanted to let you know that with this session, I'm doing it through sort of 2 different lenses for you. One of those lenses is inviting you, if you are a practitioner yourself, a therapeutic practitioner, or someone that does healing story work, applied story work, that there'll be times when I'll sort of give a little behind the scenes as a practitioner kind of way to look at some things. And you may also be joining as a person who wants to experience the journey through the metaphors, both of those things. So sometimes I'll sort of pull the curtain back and talk practitioner to practitioner, if that's all right. I was thinking about that with this just because of the context of this particular festival as well. And before we continue, I wanted to just set a safe space with you all that we're not going to dive into trauma itself today. There might be a little bit of talking about the effects of broken, what effect that might have on you, but we're not going to dive into trauma itself, just letting you know. If on your own afterwards you want to dive in deeper, great. We can talk about that, and you can keep journaling on your own. The other thing I wanted you to know is that every question is an invitation, so you can choose to not answer it. And there's different ways to respond to the questions. So I probably should have mentioned this at the outset, but if you're a person who journals, if you want to have a journal handy, or you want to have some paper handy, if you're a pen and paper kind of person, you might want to have that handy for some of the questions that we'll explore. Or maybe you want to have a Word document or a Google Doc open on your computer. You might want to respond in the chat to some of the questions, and that's absolutely fine. You can respond to the group, or if you want, you could respond to me privately, whatever feels comfortable for you. And maybe some of you at some point will want to respond to the questions verbally. I'm going to give space for that, to have verbal response if that feels right for you. Again, everything's an invitation. So whatever you feel comfortable doing, great. The other thing about a safe space, whatever you might read here in the chat or hear here, please let it stay here unless it's your direct experience. If it's your direct experience, feel free to share that, but please don't share anyone else's. That's just really important for a safe container. I am going to share my slide deck afterwards. And since I don't have the registration from here, if the slide deck is something you're interested in, you can put your email in the chat. You could privately send it to me. So just letting you know, I'll share the different questions that are asked. So I think that's everything. All right, so I am going to share my slide deck with you now. I'm going to do the share screen and show you a little bit about Kintsugi, because I'm aware not everyone is familiar with this art form. So sometimes seeing a picture is really helpful. So I'm going to do that part. And you're going to see a couple areas that are grayed out. That's because I want to see some of you. So down the side, I've got the little video panel open, but you shouldn't really miss much of anything from the slides. So we'll start with this one. Thanks for your patience as I need my Dollar Tree readers to read the smaller print. So kintsugi, the actual words mean golden joinery, and it's also sometimes referred to as kintsukori, golden repair. And you might be wondering, well, what is this exactly? So it's an ancient Japanese art. It goes back hundreds upon hundreds of years, and it's the repair of broken pottery by mending the breaks with lacquer or glue, dusted or mixed with powdered gold, silver, or platinum. And in the traditional way of doing kintsugi, it's layers and layers of lacquer and then of the precious metals as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the idea behind it as a philosophy, Kintsugi treats the breakage and repair as part of the honored history of an object rather than something to disguise. So it's really about illuminating the broken rather than hiding it. And that's something that has been really powerful in my own personal journey, as well as with the people I feel incredibly grateful to work with using this as a therapeutic tool. And I just saw something in the chat and I want to make sure, sorry, I opened that. Oh, thanks, great, glad you're here. Okay, so, and then just to break it down into really simple terms, it's repairing the valued broken pottery by using those precious metals, illuminate rather than hide flaws, and the repaired vessel is actually viewed as stronger than the break. So in therapeutic settings, this can be a really helpful tool when we're talking about that idea of feeling broken or beyond repair. And kintsugi can become a tool to look at broken differently. And we're going to go on that journey a little bit together today. So thanks so much for being here. So what does it look like? This is the kintsugi art form. This is a professionally done piece with all those layers. Sometimes there are larger pieces missing, and so it's an invitation to pull something from another piece of pottery. And this is the piece that I did. You can definitely notice this is not a super professional art piece. You can see that there's the gold and the glue are lumpy. The top is not completely flush. And it's also can be a real journey in letting go of perfectionism as you do the physical process. So that was the piece that I had made initially. And part of the exploration is really looking at when you do the physical process beyond the metaphor, and even in the metaphor exploration is what do you see in the pieces? What might you notice? And when I was working with this person, and anything I'm sharing, I have permission to share. It's important that I let you know that. When I was working with this person, they noticed it almost looked like the silhouette of sort of two bodies, and then it was the idea of melding like a broken relationship back together, which was something really beautiful to explore. And then this one had a missing piece that the person chose to leave out because life is like that sometimes. You know, we sometimes have missing pieces that we can't bring back. And what if we explore that as something that might be okay rather than something that's not? Sometimes people noticed the object was whole on the outside, even though there were cracks on the inside. And we talked a lot about how our healing journey can be like that. We can look totally fine externally, and yet inside, what we may be carrying in our minds and internally is a different story. So it's an invitation to explore, well, what's that story as well? And then this was from Sarah, who wanted her name shared. Sarah had chosen to put hers together in a different way. And it was the first time I had been doing Kintsugi workshops for 2 years. And no one had ever asked, do I need to put the pieces back the way they started? And she asked, she said, "Do I have to put them back into a bowl?" And I said, "No. What would you like to do with the pieces?" And so this is what she ended up putting together. And in the end, we agreed it looked like a lotus flower. And that led to a whole other exploration of what was the metaphor of the lotus flower for her. So it's also an invitation of, you don't even have to put the pieces back like a bowl, which can be really interesting to explore. So there's a proverb: the true life of the bowl began the moment it was dropped. And Leonard Cohen's lyric, which has been one of my favorites, and now it's even more favorite: there is a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. So in exploring those cracks, again, what might we see differently? What might we see differently? And I just want to check the chat really quick in case it's something great. Yes, and I will definitely share the slides for those who have requested. And you can request later on too. I'll save the chat for myself. So narrative therapy practice, I mentioned it, and then I realized a lot of people aren't familiar with it. And like I said, I wasn't either until 2019. So narrative therapy practice is really, if you think about it, as a therapeutic form of conversation and questions that acknowledge the complexity and context of life experiences. Well, what does that mean exactly? Well, part of it, it believes every person is an expert in their own life. So narrative is not about diagnosing, it's not about labels. It's really about this person who's sitting with me, whether or with any practitioner, whether individually or in a group, they are an expert on their own life. And my job is to ask curious, hopefully compassionate questions to unpack some things together. We go on the journey together. And one of the beliefs that I love, and this is from Michael White, one of the founders of narrative practice: the problem is the problem. The person is not the problem. That can be so liberating to realize that we aren't the problem. The problem is the problem. And then we explore, what are all the influences that keep this problem going? What are the influences that strengthen this problem? What are the influences that maybe take the power away from this problem? So speaking of those influences, we explore these different layers of influence, these impact of messages and ways of being that we learned. And there's a whole bunch of layers. And that could be a whole other workshop. So there's family of origin, culture, gender norms, religion, societal norms, the region that we live in. So all these layers of being and acting that we were taught were okay or not okay, appropriate, not appropriate. So in narrative practices, we explore how these messages influence how we see ourselves, how we see others, and how we navigate the world around us. And it's a really, I find it to be a really exciting, sort of empowering practice, in which part of the journey is really looking at what skills is this person using to survive these problems, rather than viewing a person as somehow deficit, as somehow deficient. Narrative really looks for, what are the skills and abilities this person used? So as we go through the metaphors in just a short while, that might be something for you to consider when you think about the glue that helps you hold different pieces of your life together. Maybe you want to think about that as skills that you use, abilities that you have that help you get through. So that's just a little bit. And with narrative, the final part, well, not the final part, it's a really complex journey, honestly. But one of the other important parts is we really seek to move from the problem story to the preferred story of the person. And in narrative sessions, the other thing I love is there's not a specific goal by the end of the session. It's like wherever the conversation takes us, great. What are we going to explore in that conversation? And really putting the two people or the group like this, so on an equal playing field, rather than the practitioner as expert and the person sort of down here. Like I said, they're really an expert in their own life journey. So we're going to start exploring some of the metaphors, and there's that metaphor of Kintsugi. And that's one of my favorites, is what if we aren't forever broken? What if, in fact, the history of all these things we've experienced creates this beautiful vessel that is who we are and really honors the journey, and it doesn't diminish either. I think that's important to state. I'm not interested in diminishing the journey the person went through. It's really about acknowledging all those layers that impact our life narrative and then exploring them kind of in new ways. So what I'm going to do is actually stop the screen share. And let me see, stop the screen share, because I really want to be able to see you as well while I'm talking about this. So we are going to do this exploration together. And like I said, it's an invitation for you to journal, and I will share the slides. So if you just pop your email, like I said, you can send it to me privately, and I will be very happy to share that. And I'm just gonna, let me minimize this for a moment so I can see. All right. Thanks for your patience as I just moved some things on my screen.
Could you send your email address?
I will put it in the chat. Absolutely.
Thank you.
You are so welcome. All right. So as we are moving through this process of talking about the different layers of narrative and of Kintsugi, actually, part of what I really am interested in is what's called deconstructing, looking at this story of broken. That can be such a heavy word for so many of us, especially if it was a word that was placed onto us by other people. And that it can be such a weighted word. And I'm curious too, in exploring the metaphor, is what are those ideas and messages that we've heard about broken outside of ourselves too? So you can think about this in different ways. So in talking about broken, and I'm going to do that behind the scenes for a moment as a practitioner. So if you are also a practitioner who works with healing story work, thinking about when we talk about ideas, how can we think about them externally? Like it doesn't only need to be a person who says, oh, I feel broken, or I've been told I'm broken. We can look at so many different layers of what's broken, maybe about the region we live in. What's broken in maybe the gender norms that have been assigned to us and that we grapple with. What might be broken in society that we live in. So I really appreciate that about this process, in that it can be so many different layers that are explored, not only personally. So I just want to invite you, as you're exploring it today, that you have choices. And I think choices can be so powerful for all of us, is to think about broken in a lot of different layers. So this is the part where I want to invite you into, well, first, actually, I just want to check if there's any questions, just in maybe not a giant dive, but into does the art of Kintsugi make sense just as an art, with the idea of repairing, rather than looking at something as forever damaged? It's really looking at valuing the journey of that vessel and honoring the breakage, not diminishing it, honoring it and acknowledging it, and then seeing what else can be illuminated. So I saw some heads nodding. I just want to check in before I go to the next part. All right, more heads nodding. Great. All right. And then with narrative practice, I want to put the name of a book into the chat. If you're curious to explore, this is an awesome introduction, and it's got a great title. What is narrative therapy, if I could say it, an easy to understand introduction. And this was one of the books in our grad program that I found incredibly accessible. It's written in such a great style, and the author is Alice Munro, I believe. And I will confirm that. But it's What is Narrative Therapy? An easy to understand introduction. So this next part is where you might want to have a journal handy if you don't already. Or you might want to share some of your thoughts in the chat, either to the whole group or personally. I wanted to let you know, I see a hand up, Louise. Yes, I see your hand, Louise.
I have a question about the process of the actual process with the pottery. Are the pots, like, do you intentionally break a bowl?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Thanks.
and that's really powerful. And that could be a whole, so I do a whole other session. Initially, I was going to do the breaking and mending today, but 90 minutes is not enough to explore both metaphor and to do the process. The process itself can take 90 minutes to 2 hours. So yes, great question, Louise, and thanks for asking. We do actually intentionally break the pottery. And if anyone's interested, March 28th, I'm going to do a session. It'll be in the east. So for some of you, the timing probably won't work. It's 6:30 p.m. till 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll share the link later for that if you want to explore the actual breaking of the pottery. When I work with, I don't call them clients because again, we have this equal relationship. So I love one of the terms in narrative is consultant. So when I'm working with consultants, when we break the pottery, I always talk about how it's permission. You're given permission to break the pottery in this moment. Because as you might imagine, any of you who work therapeutically, or maybe you have personal experience with any kind of abusive situation, breaking something can be really scary. So the context of that for the group is really important to honor in that moment. You have permission to break this in this moment, and you're in a safe space in this moment to break it. Even virtually, I've done sessions virtually with groups of women who are all survivors of domestic violence. And we really spent quite a bit of time setting that safe container first. And I always do the metaphor. This metaphor part is really important to set that safe space. So there's also relationship. There's relationship built with the people you're working with. I don't start with the breaking of the pottery as a first. It would never be a first session. So just sharing that with you as well, sort of behind the scenes. And then we talk a lot about what does breaking this pottery bring up for you? Some people were like, that was, for me, it was so empowering to be able to break something intentionally and like not get in trouble for it. That was awesome. And some folks like to, I've had a really interesting journey with re-exploring breaking things. So there's a lot that happens, as you can imagine. So Louise, I hope that helps. And I know I sort of answered more, but because there is so much that happens. Yes, and someone just shared, breaking open, releasing, giving space, seeing differences, locating tensions, remembering, highlighting history, celebrating the process. Yes, and that and more. So much happens in that physical process of breaking and mending. I've had people that I've worked with say things like, it was like holding pieces of my life in my hands. And I got to choose how I put them back together. Even if they mended it in the original shape, it's going to look different with that highlighting of the gold and the glue being used. It's also a really amazing exploration for, I mentioned perfectionism before, when the bowl maybe doesn't look like you thought it might. And then you can talk about what's that bring up for you, and what's the story of perfectionism? Whose story is that? So there's a lot that can be explored through this. And just so you know, today is like the gateway, and I'm happy to work with you more as well. So let's continue. And with this part, I would like to go into the exploration of the different metaphors. And as I mentioned with Kintsugi itself, as that meta metaphor over kind of arching over everything, even that conversation about this bowl or this pottery that was broken and not discarded can be a really interesting conversation to have. You know, the fact that we don't throw this away, that we do take the time to mend these pieces, and how might that influence someone's narrative that it is repaired and it's not forever damaged. So I mentioned that before, and it's something for you maybe to journal about on your own, is what does that metaphor perhaps bring to you as something to explore later, this idea of, oh yeah, what if we do repair this? And to peel back behind the scenes for a moment, when I work with the people consulting me, each one of the metaphors is a separate session. And that was something I learned by doing the sessions. So broken is usually a whole hour talking about that. And then the glue and the pieces kind of going together. That's a whole session in and of itself. And then, like I said, the mending is a whole session. And then there's a follow-up session. What did you notice? You know, I encourage people to keep that mended pottery somewhere where they can see it. And throughout the week, maybe pick it up and look at it. What do you notice? What did you notice? Or what else bubbled up after the session? And it's the conversation can continue. I worked with someone this summer who wrote to me again in December and said there was a whole other layer that came up that she wanted to explore. So what I love so much about this metaphor is it can keep going. There's so many layers that can happen, and then other metaphors that come up even in the process with the people you're working with. So it's a really exciting metaphor. And someone shared too, is what sticks is how we choose to put together the pieces. Yeah, it can be really empowering. Someone else had a moment, and I want to share again. I have permission. There was a piece missing from the very top. And a piece that she decided, instead of, I shouldn't say missing, I'm saying a piece that purposefully was not glued back in, but was one that the person chose. She was able to set it in, but she could pull it back out. And for her, it was this metaphor about boundaries, that she could put that piece there when she wanted to hold a boundary really tight for herself. But if she wanted to open the boundary for someone, she could literally, as a symbolic reminder, but a very literal also, is she could pull that piece out. And then she would keep the piece nearby to remind her that she was allowed to open that boundary and close it back up. I thought that was such a beautiful way to give oneself permission. So again, there's so much that comes out of this. So we take a breath. And the first question to really dive into from a journaling point, from a reflective point, maybe you want to sit and reflect and meditate. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the question, and then I'm just going to give some space. I'm going to be quiet for a little while. Maybe you want to journal for a minute or two, or you just want to sit and ponder the question. Maybe you want to share something in the chat, and that's fine. And that's fine. So the first question is, when you hear the word broken, what comes to mind for you? What does the word broken signify or mean to you?
Kristin?
Yes, Eric.
I
Not going to
think-
stop recording just yet. I'm checking in. I'm just giving that silence for a little bit.
Okay, I was going to
I'll
ask
let you
about
know.
that.
I will let you
Okay,
know. Yeah.
okay,
There's a
very good.
few I'm going to read without attributing anything. I never attribute anything.
Mm.
And then we'll open it up if anyone wants to share verbally. But I do want to have just a few of these on the recording. And then Eric, yeah, thank you so much for checking in. I appreciate that. I didn't forget. Thank you.
Mm.
You are a very good host in mindfulness too. Thank you. So I wanted to also let everyone know that the writing today and the reflection in this moment, we are only going to spend sort of a few minutes in that writing piece. Please know that you can come back to every one of these questions at another time, and you can add more. You can add more to your reflection. And I see so much happening in the chat. And I'm not going to name any names. I just want to check. Would it be okay if I shared a few of these anonymously out loud for the recording, and then I'll turn the recording off? And I see some heads nodding. That's okay. Anonymous. I won't say any names because that's just so important to honor. Thank you so much. So if some of what I'm seeing, and again, this process is so, what I love about these questions, and also these were questions that I created out of and with narrative therapy as the foundation. So this is a process that I created through the master's program. It was my innovative project, and these questions arose. So some of the responses were broken, tears and heavy heart, barren and dry lands, surrounding peace is lost, a loss, abandoned, betrayed, and hopeless. Yeah. Shattered into tiny pieces. An ending, something no longer useful, no longer a part of me, have to remove from my life. A loss, quite a few mentioned loss. Never to be the same, less, odd, or different. Spirit, desperate pieces that cannot come together to be whole. Is a piece missing? Was it swept away? Opportunity to connect, to see each other's real hearts. Oh, it's beautiful. That just brought to mind a story that's one of my absolute favorites about the most beautiful heart. I don't know if any of you know that folk tale where there's an older man, there's a young man who shows his heart and it's pink and it's perfect. And an older man comes and says, I've been told I have the most beautiful heart. May I show you? And he opens his chest, and his heart is this Kintsugi tapestry of missing pieces and pieces mended. And he speaks about how all those different pieces were pieces from people he loved and lost, or people that he loved unrequited, or people that loved him and gave him a piece of their hearts. And I love to think of Kintsugi that way too, is what is that, all those pieces, could it also be something beautiful? And there are, even in hearing a few of these responses, and there are so many, is our lived experience, that lens of what we see broken as, is one layer. And then there's all those layers, like I mentioned, of the family messages. Maybe someone else told us we were broken. And then society's messages. If we don't behave a certain way, we're broken, or culturally, or gender norms. And all those affect what we see with broken. And I noticed that some were talking about the landscape. We're looking at climate change and broken. No matter what I do, it will never be the same. Something or someone won't be the same any longer. Yeah. Ironically, a broken bowl needs to be picked up and touched. That's beautiful to think about. Yeah. It needs to be picked up. Damaged, a feeling of regret. Tired of fighting, bullied, overwhelmed. Pain. Yeah. So there's so many different ways. Spirited away, hidden, invisible, not perfect, but whole nonetheless. Life as we know it is shattered. Yeah. So there's so many layers. And so the story is called The Most Beautiful Heart, and it's an unknown source. It floats all over the internet. I've researched, and I haven't been able to ever find an original author. And it's told in many, many different cultures throughout the world. And then someone else shared reclaim, repurpose, recycle, mend, repair, bond, which is a gorgeous way to segue into that's what this workshop and this practice is looking at is reauthor. So in narrative therapy, there's a term called reauthor. And the idea of that is to really acknowledge and honor the story that the person has, and then it's unpacking the layers. And as we unpack the layers, again, what do we see differently? So at this point, Eric, if you can, thank you so much for being gracious. And for those, in just a moment, for those who might be watching the recording, it was intentional to stop recording so that we also have a safe space for any verbal discussion. So thank you for your patience with that. And really quick, my email is storytellerkp@gmail.com. So if those maybe viewing the recording who weren't here want to message me for the slide deck, I'm happy to share it with you, and then you'll have more of the questions we explore. So thanks, Eric. And if you can stop recording at this point, that'd be great, because I want to